Hi there, hello, my name's Lance, it's great to see you. Now today, we're going to be going over how to do some post-processing. Now previously we talked about a bit of a roadmap on how to get from basic figure drawing, then how to illustrate a scene, and then some information on digital tools. So we are still going to keep to the roadmap, but this little detour can be considered like the big pineapple. It's a little bit of a detour, it's kind of interesting, but after which we are going to get back on the main road. So what we're going to go over today is some of the things we can do for post-processing an image to give it a bit more sort of pop. The other thing we can do is just go over a couple of things that people asked about that are very easy quality of life improvements, like how to use a reference layer to control selections and a few other things. So we'll go from getting an image to a basic stage, and then what we'll do is we'll go over a couple of different options for how to add some post-processing. So how to give it a bit more life, how to give it a bit more energy, how to communicate some of the materials, and everything we'll go over, I'll break down step by step. And some of the post-processing can even be things like a simple way to change from day to night. So all of these will be covered through the video. So we'll go through the basics of painting, and then we'll go over how to improve it with post-processing. Now there's also going to be some homework. Today there'll be 2 homework sheets. There'll be one where I'll ask you to take one of your images that you've already finished and then apply some post-processing to it. And the other thing will be a supplementary bit of homework for the last lesson on how to draw the head. Some people said that they'd like things a bit more scaffolded, which is great. It's wonderful to see that feedback. I'm really happy to see the work everyone's been doing on the homework, and I'm also really grateful for people sharing the challenges they've been facing, because that helps me to make better materials for you. So I really do appreciate that, and so that'll be linked in the description as well. Now once you've done the homework, feel free to pop it into the Discord. The link is in the description. And I'd also like to say, if you like this video or any of the other videos and you'd like to see more like it, or you'd like to see them more regularly, then consider becoming a member. To those who already are, I want to say a big thank you. It's enabled me to give even more focus to this and also invest more time in helping other people. So thank you from me, and also thank you from the people I've been able to support as a result of that. I really do appreciate it. Now, on to the video. Let's get started. So let's begin with the illustration we're going to be using to do the post-processing on. So we'll start with just a basic figure for this one. So starting with the 3 main bone masses, the head, the torso, the pelvis, working out those limbs. This is the same method I've outlined in the how to draw figures, the how to draw the female figure. So if you're interested in the steps in that, I've got a video and I'll link that in the description, or you can have a look over the channel. And then we'll go over the face. Same thing as before. So the head into the top half and bottom half, and put the facial details in the bottom half, and then just go over this. So this is all stuff we've gone over before, so I won't go into too much details with this. And we're going to have a figure just sort of standing in water, tropical beach, that kind of thing. And since it's for me, I'm going to give it nice long ears because I think they look great. I've just come through watching season 4 of Wakfu, so everything's going to have really long ears for probably the next 6 months. And so with that, we've got a nice pose, nice bending back, and now we can just start refining the sketch and sort of finalising some of those shapes. Remembering to flip canvas when we can, just so we can sort of self-check, and doing a bandeau kind of top there, and then the string bottom. One of the things I've noticed here is that the body's actually looking a little bit long. You can see there's a bit of a big separation between the rib cage and the pelvis, which is something I'll come back and fix later. So for now, starting on the ink, that line art was a little bit thick, so going for a bit of a thinner one. And then, again with my line art, I have just a standard hard brown brush with max smoothing, and then I do a second pass, going over it with the same brush, but with no smoothing turned on. And that helps me get all the little crevices where I'd have the ambient occlusion, it's like the darkest little spots. And then just adding a couple of details that I think sort of add to it. So, you know, like some gold armbands and getting the musculature right there. And not really adding any of the detail in on the clothing yet. I'll detail in with shading, not with line art. And now doing the detailing for the body there and the leg, and it's all coming off really straightforward. Now just adjusting that head there. One thing you do, the earlier you notice an issue, the better, because it means you've got less set of colours and other layers built up. So do try and spot any of those issues. Now I'm just going to colour the line art sort of yellowy colour, and then go over it in a separate layer to add all the dark spots to it. So this helps me see where I have and haven't added that depth to the line art. It also makes it show up on the video a bit better as well. And also not just thickening the line art, but adding any large dark areas. That would be things like around the eyes, and then just adding a bit more of those little ambient occlusion parts there, especially to things like between bits of hair. That gives it a good bit of depth. And then once all those are done, it's a fairly simple figure, so there's not that many of them to do. I can then put it all together, make it all black, and now I've got the line art done. And I can start now working on the flats. So I'm using the bucket there. You notice I had an open shape with the line arted leg there, so I just closed it up with the pen tool first. I'm just bucket filling in some basic colors. I wanted a sort of a tan and dark hair kind of look to it. And then putting the green there, just to see any bits you can see where the bucket fill hasn't gotten all the way. There'll be little spots that either I've missed or it hasn't been able to fill in. And then smoothing out some of those shapes. And that's the flats done. Now the flats are really important. The flats something we're going to be coming back to a lot during this video on how to use them to do a bunch of different things. So getting good flats in is really important. So now with the flats done, I've got that blocked out and I can move on to the background. The reason I do it once I've got the flats done is that gives me the volumes I'll be working with. With line art, it's hard to sort of see how much of the image the figure's really going to be taking up. So it's good to do it with the flats done because that shows you how much of the volume will be used. And now just doing a simple background, this one's going to be very straightforward. We won't be putting too much focus on it. Those nice sort of Pacific Island sort of mountains you get. And then just basic perspective there. And then doing some just basic coconut trees. I'm trying to cool the color, that's why they're purple. Because as things get further away, they end up sort of a cooler color. So I've gone from brown to a sort of purple color. I may have gone a bit far on it, but I feel like it works okay. And now just throwing some basic shapes on there. And again, we're not going to be giving too much focus to the background. We want the figure in the foreground to be our focal point. So just throwing some basic shading on there, just to sort of shape the bushes and so forth. And again, these won't be the focal point. They just need to be good enough that they're not noticeable. Now here's one of the other tips that can really save time, is one of the fastest brushes you can use is a lasso tool. So get the lasso, put the smoothing all the way up on the lasso, and then draw shapes in with that, and then fill them with color using the soft airbrush. This is a great way to get big regions of tone in for things like cell shading. You'll see it a lot in manhwa. They'll paint a lot with the lasso tool because it's a very, very quick way to get a lot of your regions of shading in. And you can also use it like I'm doing here to get regions of highlight. So this will be the little bits of white sort of wash in the ocean. So this is going to give us that color. So I've just saved that as a selection. And then what I'm going to do is go over it with white. And now I've got that sort of that wash on the sea. And then with that then, I've also put a little bit of black edging around it, sort of shading, because you'll see the sort of foam casts a little shadow towards its own edges. And so I've added that in, and I'm just tuning the color there for the background. And now, with that, I'll add a bit more sky to it as well, and a bit of clouds. So again, clouds are very simple. Just add a bunch of blobs, add the blobs together, make sure all the blobs are different sizes, and you've got clouds. Add another layer for shading. Same principle, slightly darker. So now, we've got the clouds done, and what we're going to do is put everything in the background into a folder so it's neat. We're going to add another layer linked to our flats layer that's going to be our shading layer. And we're going to make the flats layer a reference layer, and then we're going to set the lasso to, the magic wand tool to only use the reference layer. So what that means is that no matter what layer I'm working on, when I use the magic wand tool, it'll make a selection based on my flats. So I can just tap magic wand on a bit of the skin, and now all the skin is selected for me to work on the shading layer. So it'll ignore every other layer. It'll only use the layer that I've set as my reference layer. It's got a little icon for a lighthouse there. A lot of different software has this. Now here's the same process in Paint Tool Sci. So with that layer selected, I'll make that layer the selection source, and then I'll change the settings in the actual magic wand itself. So it'll source from that reference layer, and now when I select it, no matter what layer I'm on when I use the selection, it'll base the selection on those flats. And this lets me take control in ways like I can only shade on one area or only shade on one part of it. So I'll select the skin tone here, and if I want to sort of paint over it, add a bit of blush or whatever, or I can do things like change the hair or outfit color because I can select each of them very straightforward and very easily. I can also do things like do a hue and saturation adjustment. So if I wanted to make this, like a Smurf, I could do that. I could just grab those regions of skin and then just do a hue and saturation adjustment and then change it. Now, not all software has this option. You might be in the unfortunate boat of using an Adobe product, and you may want to do the same thing. Now, Photoshop, of all its features, doesn't have this. So what you would do, select your magic wand. You would then make sure you've got it on, not on contiguous, so it'll select everything that's the same color, it won't sort of gap. And then you'll have to select your flats layer every time you want to make a selection. So it's important to lock that layer, because what will happen is when you want to make a selection, like if you want to just select the skin tones, you'll have to be active on the flats layer, and then you'll start shading on whatever layer you want, because it doesn't have that preferred layer functionality. So the reason why you want to lock it is you'll be selecting that layer quite a lot, and you'll find yourself accidentally painting on your flats layer. So it's important to lock that layer so you don't accidentally paint on it, because you'll be needing that to refer to. So with that then, you have to click on your flats layer to make the selection, then go to the other layer, and then you can make your changes like filling in colors or, doing hue and saturation adjustments. And with those hue and saturation adjustments done, you can adjust other things, like do extra bits of shading if you want. It's just really handy to be able to control what you're selecting. I've seen some people use a method where they have, dozens of different layers, each for each flat region of color. And that can be a lot of extra effort. Now here we are going back into Clip Studio then. As you can see, I've used my referral selection to select just the skin tones, and now I can just shade, knowing I'm only painting inside that area with the skin tones. That's a real time saver. It means I don't have to worry about sort of neatening things up. I can just have that control there, and I can switch between them. And I can also do things like if I feel like the shading's too dark on the skin tone, I can, on my shading layer, select the skin tone and then just do an adjustment to make it a bit lighter or change the color or whatever it is I want to do. It's just a great way of saving time in what you're selecting to be able to just click over to it. And so now I'm doing a bit of shadow under the body there, remembering that I'm primarily, this one's going to be lit with a bright sort of sunlight. So most of the shading will be done with sort of surface plane. So is the surface facing up or is the surface facing down, and simplifying that down. So the leg on the left side will be largely in shadow, but I'm simplifying that so it's entirely in shadow. And then doing a bit of shading on the bandolier, just again some simple shading. This is what I showed in the sketch, the lines of the fabric there. And so I'm communicating them with shading and not with line, because I want that texture communicated, but I don't want a hard line to it. And now I can go over and do things like add some shading to the hair and add some shading around there. Now, this is one of the things we'll come to in a second. This is one of the issues with multiply layers for your shading. You'll notice that the same color on the swimsuit comes out very visible, but that same color on the hair, if you sort of squint your eyes, you'll see that the shading disappears on the hair, because it's adding the same amount of darkness to a thing that already has a lot of darkness, so it barely shows up. And that's something we're going to solve in the next thing, where we go over how to get your multiply layer to behave a bit better. But first we'll get through the image, basics first, before we get onto the post-processing. And so here I'm just adding a bit of reflected light, because even an area in shadow will pick up some light. So there, she's over the top of some very shiny water, so the water will have a lot of sort of ambient light coming off it. It'll have some light reflecting up as a sort of blue color. And so I'm just adding that in as a sort of soft underlighting glow. And then a bit more just to show up that shape down the center line of the body. And then the bottom of the groin there, so that where that surface faces down, I'm going to light that there as well. And then add a little bit of a sort of shine there on the leg, and maybe the start of some sort of wet surface there, because the person's in water, you would expect them to be a bit sort of, wet. And then a bit of a shine on the leg there, and a bit more there, just sort of the blue coming in. So in those shaded spots, you'll start to see that ambient light, because the ambient light won't really show up on the well-lit areas. The ambient light or reflected light will only show up in the shaded areas, because it really can't compete with the full light. And then just adding a bit of that, making it a jewel instead of just a gold thing, just a bit of colour there. And adding some shading to the bangles. Remember, these are metallic surfaces, so I don't have to stick to the same sort of shading rules as the rest of the figure. And then with that, just neatening up some of the shadows. And the next thing I'll probably be moving on to after this is getting towards making some highlights on there. So once I've got the shading in for the sunglasses, and remembering to have a nice sort of drop shadow there, because again, this figure is in full light, so I want them to have a lot of shadows that are dropped. So you can see the shadow of the sunglasses there on the head. And so now I'm adding a bit of a shine to them, trying to show where the skin is shining, because the skin is sort of wet and they're in the sun. Now here's again that using a lasso, so I'm doing all the selections of where I want my shines using the lasso, which is a much quicker way than actually shading it. And then once I've got all those selected, where I want the shine, I'll just go over with the soft airbrush, and that gives me all the shine with a nice sort of clean edge to it. It's a much, much quicker way of doing it. It doesn't have as much control, but it's a really effective way of spending the time to get it in. So the lasso tool is probably my favorite brush for the effort versus reward. And you can still sort of get gradients in it as well, if you just sort of use the soft airbrush more towards one side than the other. So it's probably one of the few times you should ever use the soft airbrush. And then here is just an extra shading layer, where I only just do the darkest parts. So you wouldn't do very much with this. It's just for those bits that are in the dark spots that are just much, much darker. So I give it a second shading layer for things like under the chin, in the armpits, in the groin there. Anywhere where there would be a really particularly dark spot, I want to give it that sort of depth. And that's largely done then for the basic figure. So you can see here the figure looks okay. The figure looks fine, but we could probably give that a bit more pop with a few different things we can do. So the first thing we'll get into is getting the multiply shading layer to give us a bit more depth of color, because you shouldn't shade with gray or black ever. You should always shade with a color, but shading with a color using a multiply layer does come with some inherent challenges. So here's an example then. We're going to use both of these two colors here to shade over the top of this grade from white all the way to almost black. And then you'll notice that it really shows up quite well on the white. But as we get further over to the right, you'll notice the difference between how it shades on the white to how it shades on the black is very significant. Best way to see is squint your eyes and you'll see the shading just disappear there. Now if we use a darker color that will show up on that dark gray, it works fine, but it overpowers the white so much that it essentially becomes black. Now the other challenge with shading with multiply is how it behaves with color. So again, we'll go from left to right and squint your eyes and you'll notice that the shading kind of disappears where it goes over the same color as itself, whereas it shows up too much on the green. So the pink on the green shows up too much because it's a very different color, whereas the green on the green disappears, but the green on the pink shows up too much. Now we can make the shading a bit smarter. So one of the ways we can make it smarter is we can use a copy of the flats to inform the behavior of our shading by grouping a layer to it. So we'll get one, this will be number one, and we'll make a duplicate of it and we'll change the behavior, and you can see them then side by side. So we've duplicated all these, we'll move them over, and now one of the first things we'll do is we'll make a copy of our flats layer and we'll group that to our shading layer. Now this will do probably about 90% of the work for you in getting the shades right, but there's still going to be about 10% left you'll have to manually do, but it'll still do 90% of the work for you. So now you can see we've set the flats layer to inform how bright the shading is, which means it works, but there's a downside to it. Where the flats are completely white, the shading will be completely white and it will do nothing, right? So what that means is we have to adjust that copy of the flats we made and just make it a little bit darker so there's at least something for it to use to shade on white, because it's taking its brightness information from the flats, which means if you try to multiply with white, nothing happens. So darken it a little bit so it has a minimum level it can put on there. And now, when we look at that shading from light to dark, you can see that it shows up just fine on the darkest areas, and it's not overpowering the lighter areas. And this is just by copying your flats, grouping it to your shading, and setting it to brightness or lightness. The names of the layers blend modes will change slightly depending on your software, but these are the big differences. You can see how it behaves on the lighter and darker areas. It won't overpower the whites, and it won't be invisible on the darker colors. Now, there's also its behavior with color, because there's that inconsistency with how it behaves on colors. So what we can do, we'll make another copy of our flats, and we'll group it to the shading layer. But what we're going to do is, instead of having it inform the lightness and darkness, we're going to have it inform the hue. And so here you can see the shading is universal across those colors. So it doesn't lose intensity on the greens, it doesn't lose intensity on the pinks when the color of the shading matches it. Now, it does have, and this is where I said, 90%, 5% of it is darkening the brightness layer, and the other 5% is changing the hue and luminosity of your layers, or maybe just making the layer that informs the hue slightly less opaque, so less of it comes through. And you can then still have your shading with a color and having that come through, but it won't disappear. So this is another thing you can do if you find your shading is disappearing when you do multiply laying over the same color. So if you're shading with a purple color, it'll kind of disappear when you go over purple. So let's do that on the image and show you how that looks. So now when we do that, you can see that with that turned on, the shading on the hair is much more pronounced, but it's not as overpowering on the skin. And of course you can make small adjustments to get it right. And so now we've got it so it'll shade on the hair and show up really well, but also you can see on the white part of the swimwear there, it's not as overpowering as it would be if we were shading with a much darker color. And then if we make another one, what we can do is we can take the color from there, and now instead of having the white parts of the swimwear, that same purple as our shading, they'll take some of the grayish blue from the flats to inform the shading. So you get the color of the shading right as well. So that can really save a lot of time. The next thing to talk about is subsurface scattering. So what is subsurface scattering? So let's get this little thing here. So we'll do that same control of the shading here on this little drawing here. So the shadow cast on the ground isn't too overpowering. And what we're going to do is make a subsurface scattering glow layer. So what subsurface scattering is when you light an object that is in any way translucent, what happens is the light will go into it, bounce around, it'll pick up the color of it, and then come back out. And sometimes it comes back out in an area that isn't lit. So it'll sort of glow a bit. So typically you'll see them on the edge of a shadow. So let's make a light here and an object casting a shadow. And in this area of shadow here, you'll have a little bit of red light bouncing out where the light went in, bounced around, got turned red, and then came out. So you'll get a little glow of red on something that's filled with blood. It'll come out a bit red or reddy orange on the edge of shadows. So what we're going to do is we'll make a selection by control clicking on our shading layer, and you can see the running ants there. And now on our subsurface scattering layer, we're going to use that selection to make a mask. This layer is set to screen. And now what that means is the mask will mean that the lightning will only happen where there's shading. And you can see it won't lighten anything but the shaded areas. And this is important because it means we don't have to be careful. We can just shade along there and it'll give a bit of a glowy rim to the edge of the shading. And we don't have to worry about going on to and overly brightening the actual lit areas. We can just shade it however we like. So let's do the same thing on the skin. So let's make a selection using our shading layer, make a layer called subsurface scattering, and then we'll make a mask using that selection. So hit the mask tool there, and now that layer can only show up where there's shading. So if we go over it now with a big brush, you'll see that it'll only appear, so it'll only lighten the image and colorize the image where there's already shading. Now what this means is if you update the shading, though, that won't update the alpha layer on this automatically. So if you decide you want to have the entire other leg in shadow, you'll have to update that mask that you made, because this won't update in real time. It'll show up by how you've defined it now in that selection. But you can see it'll only glow where there's shading. So then all we have to do is a nice soft brush and go over the edges there and add that in, and it'll give a nice glow to it. Now you can also do it on other things as well, not just the skin. You can do it on things like the hair, on concrete. It looks okay on them. It looks good, in fact. I don't know why. But you may want to, if you're going over a darker area, you may want to go a little bit thinner, because it can be a bit overpowering if you do it over a dark object, because it shows up a lot more over dark surfaces because it's a screen layer. So just be a bit sort of more sparing with it, or go over it and then just erase it out until you get to the right sort of level. And so here we're just putting that shading, that subsurface scattering along all the edges of the shadows to give it that sort of, that translucent sort of glow. And you can see it makes it look a lot more fleshy. It gives it a good color variation as well. So it's not just a sort of plastic look to it. It gives it a nice sort of look like it's got a material that light's going into and interacting with. Now here's where I talked about how it shows up a bit too strongly on dark areas. So that was going over and erasing some of that. So that's then the subsurface scattering. Now, one of the things you can also do with that is once you've gone over and done the edges, grab a really big soft brush and use a really big soft brush to add just a sort of a general glow where the light's bouncing around, maybe coming out a bit more. You can also change the color of it too. So if, for instance, you have a character that would be filled, or an object that would be filled with something that isn't red, maybe the light bounces in and comes out blue, you can change the subsurface scattering to blue. So it's entirely up to you what color comes out. Typically it'll be red, maybe a reddy orange if some of the sort of yellow or from the sunlight survives and comes through. Now, with that, that's basically subsurface scattering done. So the next thing we want to have a look at is how to do something like maybe adding a layer to give us some skin tone variation. So since, people are made of, flesh and blood and bone, etc., they're not one universal material all the way through. What that means is you want to give a bit of variation to it. So you select your skin, and then with a nice big soft brush, you'll go over and add some red, or a purpley red, to anywhere where the bones would come close to the surface. So that would be things like your nose, cheekbones, elbows, shoulders, collarbones, hip bones, knees. The next thing you can do, select your line art, and you can add a bit of color to it to soften it a bit. The next thing I want to talk about is how to do the sweat or water droplets. They're a nice effect. They're really easy to do, and they can really communicate someone who's like in water or someone who's exercising. So what you want to do is start with 2 layers on top of your image. You'll have a layer for shading and a layer for highlights. So for the shading, you'll just pick a, similar to your skin tone layer, and then for the highlights, just pure white. And then what you'll do is you'll do the dark part of the droplet first. So that's sort of like a rim, and you'll have it thicker at the bottom, so you really want to vary that weighting. And then you can do the shine either as like a single big highlight on it, or a single big highlight and then a tiny rim of white underneath it. And that can do a really simple job of doing just some water droplets that can really communicate that material very well. It can do for sweat or someone who's swimming, etc. Now with that, we'll go over and do that on the image then. So we've got our 2 layers, and then we'll do it on top of your line art layer, because you can see here I want it to sort of leave the frame a little bit. Well, not leave the frame, but I want it to leave the figure. So I want it to go over the top of the line art layer. And I won't do too much of it. If you do too much of it, it sort of looks kind of beady. So just do a few bits here where it would collect, and you can sort of imply that the rest of the surface is wet by showing just a few drops here and there. And having them sort of hang as well can be good, especially off the hair. Having the droplets hang off the hair like that can really sort of communicate that it's a thing that is on the figure. It's not just like a texture map, etc. Now that's those. So we've got the surface wet now. Now one of the other things we want to do is some blur. So what we can do is, since Clip Studio doesn't have a selection, like a gradient selection, make a new layer, drop a gradient on there, then control click on that layer, and now you have a gradient selection. And you can then use the blur tool on that selection to blur things in a sort of a tilt shift kind of way. So you can blur the background and the foreground, and give it then a focus on the figure. So you can see what happens then with that blur. Having it on there will give focus to the figure. Now you can also do a bit of localized shallow depth of field on the figure. So you'd select the areas you want to be sharp. You then feather that selection. So it's sort of blur the selection. I'll show you what that looks like there. So you can see it's not a hard edge anymore. And then you invert that, because if you blurred it now, you just blur the bits you want to focus on. So you invert it, then blur it, and you'll see now that it does a little bit of blur on the areas that aren't the focus. So it's really good for close-ups and that kind of thing. Now the next thing to go over is how to get sort of a color hierarchy. So just get a normal big soft brush, some yellow and some blue, and just the areas that we broadly lit and the areas that we broadly unlit. Change that layer to overlay, and then lower the opacity, and you can see that'll cool your shadows and warm your highlights a bit, but just don't let it be too strong because it can be quite overpowering. Now the next thing to do is we're going to do a clone of the completed image. We can do a tone adjustment, and so really sort of deep fry it. So we've made a clone of the whole image in a new layer, we've deep fried it, and now we're going to blur it. Now what that does is that gives us a sort of blurred one. Now we can change that to either screen or overlay, and then lower the opacity on that so it's not so overpowering. Screen or overlay will do different things, so it depends what you want to do with this, but it's a good way of giving a bright sort of sunny atmosphere to it. Next one's really simple. Clone the whole image, blur it by 10 to 20, and then lower the opacity, and that just sort of softens your line art. If you do it more than that, it can give you a sort of a steamy look, like if you're in like a sauna or whatever, it'll give you that sort of soft focus. Now, next one is adding some noise to it. So, new layer, Perlin noise, about 2.5 in size. Set the layer blend mode to overlay, and then just lower the opacity down until you get it to a point where you've got some noise on there, but it's not making the figure look too textured. Now, next one is making a gradient map. This one's really easy. Make a gradient map that's got, whatever color balance you want. You can give it different moods, like, day, night, warm, cool. Once you've got it where you like it, set that layer to color, and then lower the opacity to make that effect so it's not too overpowering. Now, similar to this, you can also make a new layer, an adjustment layer, that has brightness and contrast to it. That one's fairly sort of self-explanatory, just to give yourself a bit of contrast and control that a bit better. Now with that, we'll put all those in a new layer, and we'll try some of the other, they're still very quick, but some post-processing effects you can do to give it a bit more pop. So this one, for instance, let's imagine there's the sun behind her, and it's casting that big sort of light on the water. Now we're actually going to put that on top of her because we're going to put a soft brush there to show the glow coming through. And this one, again, it's better for a close-up view, and you can see there it gives it that look like there's light coming from behind. Now, you can also do rim light by making a new layer of blue, setting it to multiply. You then make a selection of your character, and then you start cutting some of that blue out. So it looks like I'm painting in a highlight, but I'm actually just cutting away some of that shading. And this then lets me have, it's good for not just sort of nighttime, but you can also use it for like evening and afternoon backlighting, cover the whole thing in a color, and then get rid of it. And you can also use it for some of the, like she's lit by a spotlight, so maybe there's something on the land there that's casting a bit of light. And you can also do like a color temperature adjustment as well to really add to that. So a color temperature adjustment layer on top can help. And then just going back over again with the eraser, a really soft one, and erasing some bits out to sort of soften those highlights there. Now that's basically it. We've gone through and we've applied some post-processing effects to our final image. So here's the final image, and then here's the image with just some post-processing effects on it. And then here it is with a very simple day for night applied to it as well. So I hope that's helped you see how we can apply just some quick post-processing effects to get an image a bit more pop, or even change the image a bit to give it some change of time of day to things like evening or afternoon. Now with all that, there is some homework, of course. So like I mentioned before, there's going to be 2 homework sheets. There'll be one homework sheet, which is for this video, which is going to be where you put up one of your images before and after applying some post-processing effects, whichever ones you feel suitable. You don't have to apply all of them, of course. I would typically only apply 1 or 2 myself, depending what the image is. And of course, the other homework sheet is a follow-up to the head drawing one, which is sort of a pre-instruction to that one, because that one was fairly, intermediate advanced in challenge level. So this is one to get you a bit ready for that one, if you found that one a bit challenging, or just do it together with it, because it's a good bit of practice. So that's it. Now, thank you again for watching through it. Like I said before, if you've got your homework or any of your images you want to share, pop onto our Discord and share them there. We've got a great community. And again, if you like this video and want to see more like it or want to support the channel, by all means, please join the Patreon. That would be wonderful. Otherwise, I will talk to you soon and you have a good day. Cheers. Bye.